alliance is among a number of political parties claiming credit for the reversal of the value-added tax hike by Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana. Now, the DA's Federal Council Chair, Helen Zille, yesterday said the party played an instrumental role. Today, the DA said to meet with the ANC to discuss the future of their coalition relationship. For more, I'm joined by the Democratic Alliance's leader, John Steenhuisen. Mr. Steenhuisen, appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us in studio as well. Weren't invited to yesterday's presser. Sentiment, does that strain things at all?
Well, I'm very glad we weren't invited to yesterday's presser because that's what I would call a perp walk. All the perpetrators of the VAT hike were sitting at one table there. Those are the people that voted for the VAT increase. And I found it rather odd yesterday that they seem to want to have credit for setting the house on fire, and then they want to have credit for putting a bucket of water on it. It's very clear we were from the beginning opposed to the VAT hike, 2% as well as a 0.5%. And I'm very glad that we now have had this about turn because it now allows us to go back to the beginning of the process and put on the table a credible costed budget that's going to focus on jobs and growth for the South African economy. I
mean, look, a lot of those parties will ultimately say we were opposed to the VAT hike. The only reason we voted for it was so that it doesn't happen, but that we can have a constructive conversation outside of the courts. But I'm going to relay that conversation in just a bit. The MK party is calling for Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana to step down. Would you support those calls?
Well, I think that when we created the Government of National Unity, there were portfolios that were given to the parties. I think it's a prerogative of the President. As a member of Cabinet, I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment on a fellow Cabinet member, but I think the President needs to consider the financial credibility going forward now in terms of our budgeting. We're now heading into the third budget 3.0, and I think we need to urgently move forward with decisiveness and get a budget passed in Parliament with the majority it needs to be able to start steadying the markets so we can go back to focusing on growth and jobs, because that's essentially the ultimate problem here. We mustn't be distracted by that. The real elephant in the room is that our economy is not growing. And that has been the discussion that we've been trying to precipitate during this entire process, that we'll be back in February next year with tax spend and cut unless we get the economy growing at a greater rate than it is now.
If we're following the mandate that you've then just put forward, your own deployee, Asho Sarupen, is obviously Deputy Finance Minister. Correct. Did he play a role in drafting the budget? If so, it ultimately goes against what the party wants in itself. So would you then need to recall him?
No, not at all, because there were clearly two fiscal frameworks being run. Remember that the fiscal framework was presented to Cabinet many, many weeks before this VAT fiasco. It was a fiscal framework, it was costed. It was only sort of a week before the budget that was supposed to be passed in Parliament that we suddenly had a fiscal framework that included VAT. And Deputy Minister Rupin found out about it on the Thursday. On Friday, Minister Godongwana requested a meeting with myself, the DA's Federal Executive Chair, and Dr. Dion George, where he broke the news about the 2% to us. We were very clear from the beginning we wouldn't support it. So it was very clear there were two fiscal frameworks being run. One that was presented to Cabinet, which we were all comfortable with and relatively confident we had a costed budget. Then suddenly this other one appears out of the sky, and I think that was also why, even within Cabinet and including members of the ANC, it took them by surprise that there was now suddenly this 2% VAT hike, and why the original budget speech was.
So was this ultimately dictated by the Finance Minister?
Absolutely.
Was this just brought about by the Finance Minister?
This was something that the Finance Minister conceived. At every single step of the negotiations that we had within the subcommittee, every time we put on the table alternatives to VAT increase, he said categorically that there's no alternative to VAT increase. And he carried this all the way through into the court papers. He said very categorically in his court papers that there is no alternative to VAT. It was only faced with the prospect of an adverse judgment after a terrible day in court for the Treasury that there was this volte-face in the middle of the night away from the VAT increase.
It's been a while since we've heard midnight sort of announcements then by the government, isn't it? Did your party at any point make concessions for the budget that included the Expropriation Act, the Bella Act, in favor of keeping VAT?
And I noticed that Songeza Zibi yesterday said that we're extortionists. Let me tell you what we were trying to be extortionists.
Because even the Finance Minister said so as well.
Well, it's not true. And if you look at the final document, which is now in the public arena, that the final document that we were almost on agreement with before the treachery with Action South Africa and others, there were 4 key things that the DA wanted. A comprehensive spending review, a look into privatising the ports or public-private partnership on ports, a comprehensive regulatory review, and we wanted line of sight as a coalition partner on Operation Vulindlela through our Deputy Finance Minister. And our suggestion in that document was that the 2 Deputy Finance Ministers. Those are the 4 things we were asking for. NHI wasn't there, Bella wasn't there, the Expropriation Act wasn't there. So if Mr. Zibi wants to call me and my party extortionists, I'm happy to bear it. I am an extortionist. I'm an extortionist for jobs. I'm an extortionist for growth.
Yeah.
I'm an extortionist to get South Africa moving forward so that more South Africans can get work and our economy can start to grow. So I'm very happy to wear the title that's been given to me. I'm an extortionist for economic growth and jobs.
How else then do you mend the relationship with the ANC as it currently stands? Because it feels very fractured.
No, absolutely. Look, we had a very constructive meeting with Mr. Mbalula and his team a week and a half ago.
Yeah.
We've got a follow-up meeting today. It was meant to take
you'll
place
be there
yesterday.
as well.
I'll be there. That's why I'm gracing you in the studios today. I'll be there. Look, I think we've got to find a way forward now where we have maturity and cool heads. Trying to run a coalition with a 204 seats majority is going to be very difficult.
Yeah.
And if they think that by doing that, they never have to deal with the DA again, they need to think again. Because that means you have to have every single one of your members in Parliament for every single vote. Because if you're trying to run a 4-seat majority, every single item on the order paper, appointments, committee reports, legislation, is going to become a debate like the fiscal framework, where there's going to be this...
Some would say that's the way the GNU should perhaps work, because then it's interrogated.
Well, I don't think that you're going to create the credibility and stability that international markets want to see. And given the geopolitical tensions and the geopolitical outlook, the IMF and the World Bank have now revised quite significantly their growth outlooks for both South Africa and the world. What we need now is a stable government with a big majority, and that involves the DA. And we are happy to play our part constructively.
Sure.
And we haven't been angels in this. I'm happy to admit that we have also perhaps could have done a few things better. And I've made that very clear to the ANC.
What are one of those things? Because I was going to ask if your modus operandi will now be to ultimately go to the courts, as is your prerogative, with every GNU decision that you perhaps are unhappy with. No, it's not the case
at all. It's very expensive, and we don't approach the courts lightly. We only approach the courts in this instance because Cabinet wouldn't listen. We then wrote to Parliament and said the process you followed is incorrect. We warned them before the process unfolded. We warned Parliament again on the day of the vote that the process they had followed was not the right one. And we were left with no other option then. Our partners in the coalition had gone outside of the marriage to look for partners outside and to do deals. We have never done that, not once, not ever. We have only negotiated with the GNU partners. And we had no other option. But that's the point I wanted to get to. I think what we need now is to have a way to have these controlled explosions rather than external public explosions.
So a lot more around the debate table. Then.
Exactly, and internally.
Yes.
And not on social media, and not in the glare of the public. And it doesn't matter whether the DA is part of that GNU or not. You're still going to have a multi-party coalition, and it is impossible for a 10-party coalition to agree on everything all of the time. So what I'm looking for is a mature, cool-headed forum for us to be able to have the disagreements behind closed doors and outside of the public glare and try and sort those things out there so that we end up with greater stability and we can then focus on the important mission, which is growing our economy.
I want to go back to some of the things that you say you've perhaps learned, because despite all the bluster and everything else that has happened, the ANC has also said that they've learned a lot about collaboration, trying to speak to their partners as well, which is very important. Is that going to be something that you'll do a lot more of? Only because, and I only say this because there are parties that in that meeting yesterday said there was a lot of grandstanding by the Democratic Alliance. From the first time that VAT was even mentioned, the first time around in February at the first budget, that ultimately then didn't happen. And that they don't want the grandstanding to happen, and it would be better around a debate table.
Well, I mean, I think you need to be clear what grandstanding is. I mean, you must remember, we're all political parties.
Yeah.
We have constituencies that we have to report back on. I've got to explain to my constituency about why we are in the GNU. And particularly when you are in a government where your largest partner has simply signed legislation without consulting you,
Yes.
has gone outside of the relationship to speak to other political parties, I have to explain to the millions of people who gave me a mandate in the last election, A, what we're doing in government, why we're there, and what our mission is. But I take the point that perhaps we do need to look at mechanisms about how we can speak to our partners internally in a constructive way. And that's certainly the learning curve that I think we've been on. It's the first time I've been involved in a coalition. And it's certainly at a national level. And of course, there's a learning curve and a settling period. But I think that there are lessons all round that we need to take from this particular experience. And hopefully it can make the GNU stronger.
Because that's going to benefit everyone else, right?
Absolutely,
that
and the economy.
Country.
As I said, given the geopolitical place, we are in the crosshairs of the United States at the moment. One of our largest inward investors and one of our largest trading partners. We are navigating a very stormy international economy. And what that needs now is a government that is united, that is able to have coherence, and is able to put a sure step forward. And that is where the DA would like to play a role. We've always been in the government for the stability, the growth and jobs.
What happens now in the parliamentary process, though? And it seems like I'm taking you back a little bit, but because ultimately it's knowing that the ANC can actually pass this budget without your particular involvement at the end of the day. How exactly do you move forward in that parliamentary process?
Well, I think that we obviously within the GNU, as cabinet members, we will obviously need to see the new framework and the new DORA and the new bills that the finance minister intends to bring. Right from the beginning, we've had some very constructive proposals about how you could avoid having to have a VAT hike. And let me just say briefly about that. We're talking about 0.7% of the total budget. That's the income that the VAT increase would have brought to the table. If we can't find 0.7% of savings and deferments and cuts, then there's something wrong with us and our accountants if we can't get that right. Even a household, even a company that can't find 0.7% savings has got a bigger problem than...
So you think the 75 billion that needs to be plugged in the medium term, we can find it through savings rather than trying to get more money from people?
Absolutely. I think that we can, and we put a number of proposals right from the beginning, 8 weeks ago, when we spoke out against VAT in the first instance and put on the table a number of mechanisms that we believe could be used. And that is what I think our focus should now be. How do we work together to get a credible budget on the table that's costed, and we get that budget through Parliament now?
What's the out-of-court settlement that you'd like from the court case that you had against the ANC alongside the FFS?
Well, I'm happy with an out-of-court settlement, or I'm happy with the judgment. I think it was as I said, a very bad day in the court for Treasury. And clearly by the judge's line of questioning, it appeared that they weren't buying what Treasury was selling. I would like a commitment that that we now reaffirm what the actual parliamentary process is, that we stick to the law and that Parliament itself plays by the rules. We have those regulations in place for a reason, and I think they're there so that everybody knows what the rules are and we're to be played by them, and that we go back and, as I said, bring now a credible, costed budget that's not going to drive up the cost of living for South Africans and focuses on economic growth and jobs. And I think that's what we're looking for out of this process.